We also want to acknowledge that today, November 25th, is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, launching the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. A reminder that the work to end violence against women and girls is urgent and ongoing. We uplift all the organizations and the work they are doing surrounding this important day to end gender-based violence against women, girls, and to us LGBTQI+. In British Columbia, 48% of women and girls have experienced intimate partner violence. Reports have risen 17% to 25% in just the last year. And as we know, Indigenous women face some of the highest rates of intimate partner and gender-based violence and are 3 times more likely to experience IPV than non-Indigenous women. We also want to acknowledge that today's discussion includes topics that may be triggering and emotionally difficult. We encourage all of you to take care of yourself, your heart, and your spirit in whatever way you may need. We will be sharing a list of supports in the chat. If you need to step away, that is okay. Your well-being is the most important and you are not alone. Next slide, please. BCFNJC would like to acknowledge the financial support of Women and Gender Equality Canada during the implementation and transparency planning phase of the IWJP from June of 2024 to December of 2025. In holding true to our values of transparency and accountability, we are proud to host our 3rd installment of our progress update on the IWJP. We are gathered with all of you here to share key updates since our 2nd update in June of 2025. And if you were unable to attend the first virtual gathering from October of 2024 or the June one, they are posted on our Tracking Justice website. And we'll put that in the chat as well, the link to there. We will briefly share the key updates on our priority strategies. Strategy 8, man camps, resource extraction, and land exploitation. Strategy 9, crisis response, and then Strategy 15, legislation and policy as it relates to Strategy 8 and 9. And then we will hear from our guest speakers, Christine Wilson, Gitxsan Nation advocate, and Alex and Sherry from Keepers of the Circle to learn directly from community leaders who are driving change on the ground. We are so grateful to them for being here to share their knowledge with all of us. And we're also grateful to have you all joining us in this virtual circle to move this work forward in a good way with Indigenous matriarchs, women, girls, and to us LGBTQI+ voices at the center. And I'm going to pass it over to Christy.
Thank you, Tina. So nice to see so many people here today. So my name is Christy Denadmerant. I'm a member of the women's team. And before we get into why we're all here today, which is to hear from our amazing guest speakers, we're just going to provide a brief overview and update of the work that we've been doing since the last webinar in June of 2025. So before we get into our key updates, we just want to give everyone a brief background on our priority strategies that we went over in detail in June at our last webinar. And as Tina mentioned, the last 2 webinars and all of the progress of the women's team and our journey since the team was created in 2023 is on our Tracking Justice website as well. So one of our major learning curves moving forward after the development of the Indigenous Women's Justice Plan was concluding that it was not possible to move forward with full implementation plans for all 15 strategies and the 42 lines of actions. So with limited time, staff, funding, and political constraints outside of the team's control, we really needed to set some priorities moving forward. So the women's team underwent a prioritization exercise using the BCFNJC's Council Strategic Priorities, Coyotes version, that was introduced by Council in November of 2024. So this framework that we use was rooted in storytelling and Indigenous ways of knowing, prioritizing foundational values such as sustainability, collaboration, accountability, transparency, self-determination, and effective communication. So by following Coyote's version, using storytelling, our women's team grouped priorities into what we call the berry patch of justice. So with short-term berries representing ripe and ready for action, medium-term berries representing patience required, and long-term berries for those big and juicy dreams. So using Coyote's version, as a guiding lens, the women's team identified, as Tina mentioned, the three priority strategies as we move forward with our work, which is strategy 8, man camps and resource extraction, crisis response, strategy 9, and then strategy 15, legislation and policy as it relates to strategy 8 and 9. So by prioritizing the foundational values of Coyote's Berry Patch of Justice, the women's team also considered high engagement and interest from partners, readiness to move forward, and potential for meaningful impact. So now that we got a brief background just on how our priority strategies were chosen and focus on strategy 8, 9, and 15, we just have a few key updates to inform everybody about. So in September of 2025, we held a special steering committee gathering. So we gathered in circle to honor our steering committee matriarchs, Darla Peters, Viola Thomas, Dr. Gwendolyn Point. Oh, next slide. Sorry, Liam. And our council leads Lydia Whitsome and Corey Wilson, whose wisdom continues to guide the Indigenous Women's Justice Plan. So on this day, surrounded by powerful Indigenous women, youth, and government partners, we paddled together, moving from planning into true implementation. So our focus at this special steering committee gathering was on the 3 ready to pick berries. So addressing harms from man camps, strengthening crisis response, and advancing legislation and policy that's rooted in our safety and dignity. At the center of our gathering sat a chair draped with a red dress, honoring our ancestors and loved ones who could not be with us in body but were present in spirit. This was more than just a meeting. It was a weaving of voices grounded in storytelling, a reminder of our shared responsibilities. Excuse me, a reminder of our shared responsibilities and commitment to carry this work forward together. So following the steering committee gathering, the women's team worked to bring together all the strong voices, stories, and action items that were shared during our time together. And we put together a main themes and takeaways document, which will also be available for everyone to be seen on the Tracking Justice website as well. Some of these main themes and takeaways include First Nations women's voices and leadership. So women, girls, and our 2S LGBTQI+ relatives have not been present during negotiation discussions between First Nations governments and industry to develop funding measures and regulatory frameworks. Our women must be sitting at the table with government when money is being allocated. We will no longer be left out of the decisions that impact our families' lands and water. Another main theme was data collection. So there's a concern over lack of data collection. There's nothing in place between industry and government to report out on when there's incidents of gender-based violence within these man camps. This data can be used to hold industry and regulators accountable. Another main theme was uplifting grassroots and community initiatives. So as we know, it's our women, our aunties, our grandmothers, and our matriarchs. It's our grassroots networks that are trusted and act quickly and continue to do the groundwork when our women and girls and 2S LGBTQI+ relatives go missing and are found murdered. We need funding for crisis response, and it needs to flow to the grassroots who are already doing this work. So we just want to say we're so grateful to all those who participated. Some of you here as well with us today in this special steering committee gathering, both online and in person. Your voices and stories continue to be centered and guide the women's team as we work towards implementation of our priority strategies. Next slide, Liam. So another key update is the Indigenous Women's Justice Plan and our continued supports. from the First Nations Leadership Council, so the UBCIC, BCAFN, and the First Nations Summit. So as we all know, the IWJP was endorsed by FNLC in the fall of 2024, shortly after it was the Women's Plan was presented at the 3rd Annual Justice Forum. And since the women's team underwent the prioritization process and identified our 3 priority strategies, we continue seeking further endorsement of the Indigenous Women's Justice Plan's 3 priority strategies, and we looked to our partners at the First Nations Leadership Council for this support. So we continue to seek endorsement. This is as a framework to protect and prevent Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ from the impacts of man camps, resource extraction, and infrastructure development, and the continued MMIWG 2S+ genocide. This is through de-siloed crisis response planning, long-term reliable funding, legislative alignment with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and policy change. So this fall, BCAFN and the UBCIC passed resolutions to support the Indigenous Women's Justice Plan priority strategies, and a mirrored resolution was also included in the draft resolution package for the First Nations Summit that was held November 19th. So additional information on strategies 8, 9, and 10 and 15, and updates of the current implementation stages can be found, as mentioned, on our Tracking Justice website. So with the First Nation Leadership Council's continued support, we will continue to coordinate women-led structural change and lift the burden of navigating broken systems off of survivors' shoulders. We are seeking champions to walk with us and build meaningful relationships so we can work together. Continuing this work, our goal is to co-develop innovative pathways to successful implementation of all 15 Indigenous Women's Justice Plans prior strategies. Thank you, Liam. Next slide. So we also continue to work with our partners within government. So the Justice Council continues to work with the province through our joint implementation plan. The joint implementation plan identifies areas of work and shared priorities between the BC First Nations Justice Council and British Columbia that we wish to address over the next fiscal. So this was finalized with government in September of 2025. This joint plan will set out the shared priorities, which are already underway, for which work will continue, and the key deliverables and milestones for those items. So included in the joint plan is the Indigenous Women's Justice Plan 3 priority strategy. So we have strategy 8, man camp, strategy 9, crisis response, and strategy 15, legislation and policy. So this signifies the government of BC's commitment to work with the BC First Nations Justice Council on implementation of our 3 priority strategies. We are hopeful that together with support from our government partners and endorsement from the First Nations Leadership Council, we can move towards implementation of our 3 priority strategies with the voices of our Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ at the center of our work. The work that is grounded in the calls for justice, Red Women Rising, and the Highway of Tears Symposium is critical and long overdue. With the passing of Bill 14, the Renewable Energy Projects Act, Bill 15, the Infrastructure Projects Act, and Bill C5, the One Canadian Economy Act, and recent announcements in northern BC, man camps and the influx of transient workers, toxic masculinity, gender-based violence, substance use, and human trafficking are strongly linked to the systemic and ongoing genocide of our women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+. Especially in our northern, rural, and remote communities. Next slide, Liam. So with that being said, we want to turn the floor over to Christine Wilson, who is our first guest speaker, who has been doing incredible work within her community to address the impacts of man camps on our communities and our Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+. So I'm going to pass it over to Christine, and yeah.
Thank you. Very honored to be here today. My English name is Christine Wilson. My ancestral shared Gitsan name is IWJP, which means the cub that wanders off and returns a warrior. I'm calling from the ancestral traditional territory of the Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en. I work, live, and I play in Anspiox, which is one of 6 Gitsan reservations in the northern BC area. I lived in Vancouver for 35 years and I moved back to my community about a year and a half ago. And it's been an amazing experience moving back, but a very eye-opening experience as well. Seeing that northern BC is still very, the racism and the discrimination is very much alive in this area. And it almost seems like it's very normalized. So I find myself, advocating for our people when needed or when I witness it, either, when I'm on my own time or professionally when I'm called. I started my work to connect with my community at Kispiox Band Office as a cultural coordinator. And I'm transitioning from that position to justice coordinator at Gittimax Band Office. Social justice has always been part of the work that I have been doing for the past 25 years on and off reserve. I've worked with children, youth, adults, and elders. So I've gone in full circle. It's been a very fruitful career, and I'm very grateful, for all of the opportunities, and most especially speaking in panels like today. Here in Gitsan territory, we have multiple pipelines that are projects that are popping up in our area. And within the Indian Act, it states that projects can run along reservations legally. So in our area, with the Nishkalisms pipeline, we have 6,500 men, transient men, that will be moving into our territory. So that's 4 man camps. With the Kitimat LNG, we have noticed that there has been an upsurge with rental increase, where it has, been very reasonable and affordable. And now the prices are pretty much matching Vancouver housing prices. The grocery prices are going up. The violence is, escalating, as well as the toxic drug supplies that are coming into not only our reservation, but all reservations and towns. The man camps, there are temporary industrial work camps, have been linked to significant negative effects for Indigenous women and girls, primarily an increase in gender-based violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. These impacts stem from influx of transient, predominantly male workers into small, often remote Indigenous communities. I'm going to speak just from my nation. Gitsan Development Corporation, they had 12 Gitsan members sign a contract with the pipeline. And they basically signed our rights away to protest the pipeline, which will allow, militant RCMP to move in should we, organize ourselves and have a blockade. They can legally arrest us, charge us, and, our inherent rights, will be stripped of us. And that's a huge concern. We look at our neighbors, the Wet'suwet'en, and what they are going through with their pipelines and the breaches that have happened, along their territories with the pipelines. And with the influx of, man camp, Smithers is basically a big man camp itself. Last summer, an Indigenous woman signed into a a hotel room, and she put that extra lock on, thank goodness, because a white man tried to open up the door. And when she went to the front desk, her complaints were dismissed. And the front desk woman, she basically said that the men from the camps have like master keys, and she apologized and, you know, laughed it off basically and dismissed it. So that's just like one of the recent examples. A couple of more examples are on the highway. Our Gitsan women are being followed by trucks. They're being terrorized and intimidated. They had one woman who was followed from Gitsagukla all the way to Kitwanga. And when she stopped at the gas station, that truck stopped with her. When she pulled back out, that truck continued to follow her. So there's a lot of concern around the safety, not only for women and girls, but for our men and boys as well. Along the Highway of Tears, we have a lot of women that have been going missing, and actually recorded since 1970, but we've had women who have gone missing even prior to then. When the logging camp started, one of the man camps, they used a woman's skull to play a game. This skull was found, and it was, you know, brought to the attention, you know, of our nation, because they wanted the remains of this, you know, unnamed woman to be put to rest. And that's the sad, tragic reality. I know when I lived in Vancouver, you know, I'm a target. It doesn't matter where I go. And my daughter, who I love, is a target just for, you know, being First Nations. She used dating apps, and I had to tell her to take pictures of the person and the license plate. She thought I was being over the top, but that's the reality. You know, safety of our, you know, our children, safety for women, girls, men, and boys. So in my position here at Kispiox, what I started, because there have been no safety measures put in place, not by our Samokits, translation chiefs, and those that make the decisions, like Gitsan Development Corporation, you know, to invite, you know, proponents like pipelines or mines into our area. There's no consideration for preventative measures or any money to be put into a pot so that we can protect ourselves. So what Kispiox Band Council has initiated is having our own security specifically for the village. So we have, you know, a roster of members who will be going through training through Kispiox Band Office for the safety of our members. We have over 600 in our village, and we have a school. You know, we have a vulnerable population. So what I started, you know, as preventative measures for our community, self-defense classes for all ages, all genders. Today we have Madeline McCullum, As I Am Is Enough, which concentrates on self-worth and self-esteem. And then I brought Karen Goodfellows in to also take a look at safety, community safety, as well as resources and what actions, you know, we can take. The negative effects that come along with any man camp, whether it be pipelines or mines, it impacts our communities, you know, greatly. increased violence and sexual assault. There'll be a rise in sex work and human trafficking. There'll be exploiting our women and girls. In Burns Lake, they had an open pit mine, and one of the outreach workers shared with me that the men from the man camp would just like come in and literally grab the woman or 18-year-olds and take them back to camp and party. So they'll lure them in with alcohol and drugs. Hence why I set up, As I Am Is Enough workshop to focus on self-esteem and self-worth. Substance abuse issues. There's going to be like increase in drugs and alcohol, strain on community resources. Before I moved home, the emergency was shut down at least half a dozen times. There's a strain, there's a need for nurses and doctors already in Canada. So with 6,500 additional, transient workers, there's going to be a big strain, a big, resurgence on just needing more workers in our healthcare. Workplace harassment and discrimination, for those that First Nations, Métis, or Inuit that get employed. As you all know, like historically with man camps or any camp for that matter, they will promise First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, jobs, jobs, jobs. In Kitimat, one of the First Nations, a Gitxsan worker, she said that all of the locals were laid off and they brought in foreign workers. Like, yes, they'll uphold, their promises for a certain amount of times, and then they'll bring in foreign workers or cheaper labor in to replace, those that actually need it. And with our winters here, we had a lot of snowfall, a lot of rain, and yet our rivers were low and we had dried creeks. So we're going to be looking at a shortage of water soon as well. And then now we're looking at an additional, 6,500, men in their man camps where we have to provide that water. There's going to be an erosion of safety and cultural practices, pervasive fear of violence forces, against Indigenous women and girls, to alter our daily routines for safety, such as avoiding certain areas or activities like hunting and berry picking, which infringes upon our ability to connect with land and cultural practices. It's very disheartening, that these were not taken into consideration by those in leadership that have made, such big decisions on our behalf. I'm going to move into Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act. In 2022, as Director of Advocacy for Indigenous Women in the downtown East Side, before moving here to Northern BC and Spyox, 2022, my first day of work, I was signed up for a workshop downtown, and it was through Metro Vancouver Aboriginal Society. They had MMIP workshop. And when I showed up, the first speaker, her last name is Baker, and she works in North Dakota, Northern Women's Resource Center Society in Dakota. And she was talking about Savannah's Act and how she spoke to Senate and how in 2022, Savannah's Act was approved by the Senate and Trump signed off on it. Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act are two U.S. federal laws passed in 2020 to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people. Savannah's Act focuses on improving law enforcement response by requiring the Department of Justice to develop protocols and improve data collection, aiming to strengthen the coordination between agencies and tribal access to information. The Not Invisible Act complements this by creating joint commission to coordinate efforts and make recommendations to federal agencies on combating violent crime against Indigenous people. When she spoke of this, I was in awe, because I thought, why don't we have this in Canada? You know, with the MMIWG calls to action, the Tears of Hope Society, with the Red Woman Rising, as well as Truth and Reconciliation. Why do we not have legislation like this, you know, specifically to protect us, specifically to gather data so that there can be improvements with legislation or creation of new legislation to further protect us as Indigenous people in Canada? So I went the second week that I started my position, I went to an MMIWG coalition meeting, and Minister Haju was one of the keynote speakers. And she gave an update with the calls of justice. And in the end, we had question period. So I asked her, I said, and what I just said earlier, like, why do we not have this? And she said, well, you need to be a lawyer. And she didn't answer me. That was all she said. So I thought, okay. And I thought, well, let's make this happen then. So after that phone call was finished, I emailed, what is that? Women's Resource Legal Services Society in Vancouver, and the ED. She said, Christine, what you need are policy writers. And I said, okay. She goes, I can advise you, you know, when it comes to this legislation, but really you need policy writers to translate the US legislation and then, you know, turn that into Canadian legislation. So I said, okay. So I emailed BC Civil Liberties Association, and I connected with Mara, and then we started the work. A month after we started that, we then invited BC Assembly or UBCIC to be part of it. And we did a couple of presentations with ministers, and one of them was Minister Rankin, Murray Rankin, and he was wearing 3 hats at that time. And one of them was the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. And he listened to us for the 15 minutes that we had to do our presentation. And in the end, he said, do you want this to be on a private bill? Do you want a private bill, or do you want this on a public? And I said, well, what's the difference? And he said, well, it would be shelved as a private bill, and people can like look at it, read it, and it would be acknowledged. Whereas if it's a public bill, this is going to be implemented on a federal level. And I said, we're going to go public. And in 2023, we then reached out to BC Assembly First Nations, BC Native Women's Association, BC First Nations Justice Council, and the Midnight Order Database, Dr. Sasha Reed. And we then formed our federal legislation working group. And we met for 1.5 years. And then, you know, life took over for another 1.5 years. So we just finally connected again. And now we're adding the turquoise alert, which is much like, you know, the red dress alert. But as we all know, the red dress alert is a pilot project in Winnipeg, Manitoba. With the turquoise alert, if we adopt it on a federal level with our working group, this too will be implemented on a federal level. There will be no jurisdiction. We'll harmonize all the provinces and the territories, because as we know, our people, you know, cross borders all the time. The purpose of Savannah's Act is to improve the response to and data collection for cases of missing and murdered Indigenous people. The key provision directs the U.S. Attorney general. I'm reading this like all, American jargon. It'll let me transcribe to Canadians. So it directs the U.S. Attorney General to develop guidelines for law enforcement in responding to MMIP cases, enhance the data collection and strengthen reporting for gender-specific data, provides grant money for tribes to develop their own protocols for addressing the crisis. And this act was named after Savannah LaFontaine Greywind, a Spirit Lake Nation member who was murdered in 2017. I believe she was almost, to full term when she was murdered. And her baby was actually taken out of her. And her child, like Savannah didn't survive that. Her daughter did. And Savannah's parents have custody of that child, who a non-Indigenous person, took from her. The Not Invisible Act, the purpose is to increase intergovernmental coordination to combat violent crime with Indigenous lands. The key provisions to establish a joint commission on reducing violent crimes against Indians. This is US jargon here. The commission consists of tribal, federal, and local stakeholders, as well as survivors and service providers. Tasks the commissions with making recommendations to Department and Interior and Department of Justice on combating violent crime against Indigenous people. And that complements Savannah's Act. The one thing that really caught my attention with Savannah's Act, it being, a national database, is that with the data that has been inputted, this can change. For example, we all know that when RCMP collect our missing persons report information, sometimes the information isn't inputted correctly. We have white passing natives, and they don't bother to ask. They just check them off, as European. And a lot of the reports, from Indigenous people, when they do file a missing persons report, is a lot of the times the police dismiss it and say, oh, she's out partying, she'll be back in a couple of days. So that will change, mechanisms such as that, as well as a coroner. In BC, I can only speak about in BC. Anybody can be a coroner. Fawn, I could appoint you a coroner, right? There's no regulations when it comes to becoming a coroner in BC. There's only one province, and my memory is pretty bad, I can't remember. But there's only one province where there's requirements and regulations, to become a coroner. I'm not sure if you guys recall, there was a First Nations young lady who was going across BC hitchhiking, and in the interior, she was found unalived, and she had just her top on and her bottoms were down, and she was in a ditch. And the coroner came on site, and he said, not suspicious. So this is what a database could change, specifically here in BC. It could change, they have a missing murdered Indigenous task force in the United States. And I was present, during their presentation online over a year ago. And with their task force, they created 2 additional legislation to protect Indigenous people. I don't know what that is. I have to look that up. But just from what they said, in 2 of their states, the numbers have decreased, because of Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act. So we're going into 3 years, 1.5, where we were, not active, now we are back together again, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I'm so grateful, that I was able to pull together the most amazing women, policy writers and lawyers, and those with lived experience, and Midnight Order database, who is independent. And that's another thing, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, is that there have been a lot of attempts to launch a database, but they always end because there's no funding. So Midnight Order database has been doing this on their own time with no funding. And then with Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act, part of the stipulation for this is 2% increase with no time limit for funding for Indigenous people. So there's a lot of things that, we have looked at, and we feel that would actually action a lot of the calls to justice from MMIWG calls to justice, as well as we're at Red Woman Rising and the Tears of Hope. During my time as Director of Advocacy for Indigenous Women, I had the privilege and the honor to reach out, to different NGOs across Canada, and I reached out to 200, and all of them were in favor and wanting to support this work once we go completely public. So because it's work that's well overdue. And when you look at our federal legislation working group, we're all women. And that makes me so proud, because it's truly matriarchs rising. So thank you for your time, Hamia.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's we're truly grateful to have you here and to be able to speak to everyone on the firsthand impacts that man camps are having on your community, but also all the advocacy work you've been doing with the legislative working group. And I know I can speak for us that we're extremely grateful to be a part of that group, and just want to thank you for truly all of the work you continue to do, because it is a lot. And like you said, this needs to happen. It needed to happen a long time ago, because these are lives of our women and our girls and our 2S plus. So I just want to hold my hands up to you. But I also wanted to open up the floor for anyone who had any comments and or questions for Christine as well. Cindy?
Hi. I'm just wondering if you're, Christine, how concerned are you with all the projects coming on board with the federal priority list of infrastructure list? Yeah, because it seems oh, they're already planning another pipeline and not even talking to us. So kind of concerned, it's not their backyard, but it's our backyard kind of deal. Thanks.
Great question. I'm very concerned because the negative impacts on the environment, as well as socioeconomics of our people, our villages, in the towns are surrounding the pipelines, stripping us of our inherent rights, and not only moving forward with their hegemonic agenda of genocide, but also now the inclusion of ecocide. I'm very concerned. Our rivers, they say the numbers are high, but with the levels of the rivers being so low, that's concerning itself. In itself, we have salmon that are spawning eggs in areas that they never used to spawn eggs before because they can't get up to their spawning grounds. We have, more bears, grizzlies, cougars, lynx that are coming to town. Lynx used to be like a magical, vision to capture. Like it was almost like seeing a Kermode bear. But now you see them along the highway walking in one or two. We do have groups here in our area, like we have the Gitsan Firekeepers. They're very vocal and they're very proactive with their work here. And they facilitate community meetings and keep members as well as non-Indigenous updated, with all and any information. And they have created a couple of documentaries already on the work that they're doing. And once I move into this justice coordinator position, that is like also information that I will be, teaching our people, like learning what your rights are, how to advocate for yourself and others, and learning legal terms and the resources. And it's pretty sad that, this is something that we have to like initiate ourselves, where we're not having, the government or those in leadership making decisions for us think about these things, like safety nets, safety measures, resources, and, how we can protect ourselves. And with Gitsan Development Corporation, I'm just going to speak for my own nation. The agreement that they made with the pipeline is not allowing us to protest. And with all the legislation to fast track, I imagine like there's going to be already is a pushback with that because there's no consultation and no consent, and that's a fiduciary obligation, of the federal government and proponents. So again, I mean, it's all about money and not looking, in the future. And I'm very concerned. And I think that our nations need to speak more to each other and stand together in solidarity. Here in the North, every time there is a disagreement with the government, the Gitsans, Wet'suwet'ens, the Tahltans, the Nishka, the not Helsik, Kitimat First Nations, we used to stand together and band together and push against. And that was one of the deciding factors to put us in the reservations as well and keep us isolated from one another, right? To weaken us. So I hope my, vision would be for us to stand together once again as one voice, right? Because there's power in numbers. And hopefully we can start coordinating that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Christine. I'm just going to pass it over to Jackie for a question, and then we will turn the floor over to Keepers of the Circle. Jackie?
Hi there, my name is Jackie Bowes. I'm also an advocate in the Smithers area. I had my cousin Jessica Patrick Balzer that went missing, and we located her on Hudson Bay Mountain. I also I used to sit on the Carrie-Sicani Highway of Tears Committee, as well work with the Tears of Hope Society with Lorna Brown. My two questions are, in regards to the 2.8 billion federal budget cuts, which is basically more focused on the Indigenous funding? Is that going to have high impacts in regards to the advocacy and what needs to be done? And then second, with everything that's going on in BC in regards to the land claims in Richmond and in Kamloops, it's actually created high conflict and division with the Indigenous and non-Indigenous, where there's a lot of hate, a lot of it's just a lot of hate spewing on social media, and that's like putting a huge negative outlook on our Indigenous people, where they're creating these man camps, and it's just like, is something going to be done in regards to that, because it's putting Indigenous lives at risk? Thank you.
The 2.8 billion budget cuts, yeah, I mean, the band offices will definitely feel it. I was talking to my band manager a couple of weeks ago, and it's definitely a concern, especially like with our departments here, and prevention is here. The funding that we get from ISK for this prevention department. But there are also grants, and hopefully they don't return to how they used to be, where band offices were never allowed to apply. I think during COVID, that's when it all changed. So hopefully with grants out there, we'll be able to stay in operation. The land claims in Richmond, the government is always, strategic with their division, and perpetrating, racism and discrimination, by putting out misinformation. I always say, like, the biggest Ponzi's, scheme is people buying land, because it isn't, it's unceded. The government hasn't, paid for the land, and they haven't followed the proper processes. So, people basically essentially off reserve just own their houses, not the land. And, historically, like even the word land claims, was something that was invented, by media. And media has been Canadians', biggest education department, perpetrating and providing misinformation out there to non-Indigenous, like with Delgamuukh, that was, called land claims, but it was actually, a court case of reminding the government, that it's unceded territories and we have the rights, to self-govern ourselves and to oversee, the traditional territories. Yeah, the division is there, and how convenient, that has been tied in. And this is just like my thinking, with the pushing of the legislation to fast track, projects like pipelines, right? Because Wet'suwet'en did an amazing job, with getting information out there about, like, protecting our Lachiep and why, right? With the documentary that they released, what is that, like a year ago on Netflix? And even then, before then, there was like a lot of publicity with news media with how the RCMP were handling the dismantling of their blockades. So that, became international news, and it shed a light on how Canada conducts business with First Nations. And then there seemed to have been like a lot of support, but now with, Richmond, I thought that's beautiful for the Cowichan tribe. But then that opened up a can of worms of, non-Indigenous and, the feeling of insecurity and being kicked out, and there are land property values going down. I mean, and how that perpetrated, the dialogue of racism and discrimination, particularly online. And I see it all the time, and it's horrible to read, that these old beliefs, misinformation, just keep getting regurgitated. And yet there's so much information at everyone's fingertips. I'm sorry, what was the last question, Jackie?
Well, how is the is there going to be any type of like awareness to the government of what they're doing of like putting the First Nations at risk of violence because of all this information that's being distributed out to society?
That's something that specifically, the federal legislation working group, we haven't yet discussed. But I do see BC Assembly First Nations as well as UBC, I see, putting out statements out there to address, the violence against Indigenous people. And I've seen BC Native Women's Association put out statements as well. BCGEAU put out statements of, violence against Indigenous people. So there is activity, but again, I mean, coordinating that would have to be done with multiple agencies and nationally to gain the traction and attention that it so deserves. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie, for your questions. And thank you, Christine, again. Truly amazing. And like I said, we are so grateful that you were here to share your story and the work that you're doing. So we have...
Sorry.
Oh, yes.
My name is Jennifer Gunnanoot, and I just have a quick question. Christine knows me. As people may or may not know, my daughter was murdered in a nearby village in 2023. And even though the RCMP at the time said that it was an overdose, they didn't do an investigation. They said, oh, not suspicious. Then there's another murder in another village, in another nation. They said, oh, no, it's not suspicious. And then again, over the summer, there was another murder in another nation, nearby nation, and they said, oh no, it's not suspicious. So what do you think that we can do with the RCMP and then also with all these other agencies? How can we push to make the RCMP change that, where they say it's not suspicious, but obviously there is something going on there. How can we make sure that they do their proper investigation? Do we have an First Nations advocate in this area where they can attend to these um, deaths and help rule out that it isn't not suspicious? You know what I mean? There needs to be change in how the RCMP just has all the authority of saying it's not suspicious rather than doing their proper diligence and making sure they do the investigation and they ask questions that are missing, because then us as parents, as the family of the MMIP, we're left having to fight for that status that yes, something is wrong, something is missing, that yes, that person was actually murdered. Yes, there is something suspicious. Why do we not have answers to our questions? Why are the guilty being protected? Just so the RCMP does not have to change their not suspicious to suspicious, because we all know we're all human and sometimes we make mistakes, but the RCMP do not budge. How can we change that?
Hi, Jen. Thank you for addressing that. I know that your fight has been, a long fight. And addressing, the systemic racism and discrimination, dealing with the RCMP. The change, that you're asking for is actually part of the work that the federal legislation working group that I pulled together is working on, with the national database that we would like the federal government to adopt. In this way it's implemented, because like with data information, what you're addressing will actually be put like in a national database, and it would be looked at, and then it would be then determined that the RCMP, they need to change their ways, being culturally sensitive, exercise cultural humility, actually being respectful, and practicing equality, practicing inclusion, practicing transparency, and practicing communication. That would be the change with the national database. And I know it's going to be a while until we successfully lobby this. But as for now, I mean, yeah, I know it's oppressive, and I'll be working in Gitamax, so maybe you and I can connect and start working together again. Nina? Okay.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you, Jennifer. And as B said in the chat, we're all sending love and hugs to you. So I'm just going to introduce Sherry and Alex, who are with Keepers of the Circle. And they are going to speak about some of the amazing work that their organization does as it relates to gendered impacts of resource development and implementing the MMIWG calls for justice within impact assessments. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, Sherry, I see you have the slide up. Are you there?
Yes, you can see this, right?
Yes, okay.
Okay.
All right. So as was mentioned, we are focusing this presentation today on the MMIWG calls for justice. And we have sort of a little bit of an intro, but I just wanted to introduce myself very briefly. So obviously my name is Alexandra Bridges, and my Indigenous name is Thunderbird under the Earth Woman. I am of the Pike Land, and I'm a member of Matagami First Nation that's located in Treaty 9 territory in Northern Ontario. And I am dialing in right now from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, Northeastern Ontario as well. And I just wanted to extend my thanks, Christine, for shedding light on a lot of the issues that you brought forward. We will be speaking as well about the privatization of resource development planning in the context of the industry and community agreements. And, it's, as an Ontario person, it's really kind of discouraging, but also kind of sort of making me feel more solidarity to hear that these issues are really, international in scope, and that a lot of Indigenous women are experiencing similar issues across Canada, across the United States, and those things. So it's really just, reaffirming that the work and what we're trying to do over in our regions are really trying to affect positive change as well. And so as folks may know, Northeastern Ontario is a very highly developed region. There are probably about 36 active mines around the place where I live and work. And so mining has always been a part of my life personally, and I have a strong professional as well as personal interest in responsible and responsive planning activities. I've had a lot of my friends, family, my peers, myself have experienced both negative and positive impacts from resource development. So I would definitely say, it's been a huge focus of my time, my research, my energy for a long time. So I'm really honored to be here in this space, and I hope that we can have a generative conversation.
And hi everyone. My name is Sherry, and I'm calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, where I'm grateful to reside. I myself am a settler immigrant, born in a coastal city that was once a fishing village, which has previously experienced colonization under both the Germans and the Japanese. I have some previous experience reviewing projects for First Nations in BC, as well as supporting inclusion of Indigenous values in provincial water policy. And I'm very happy to be here with you all today. So I just wanted to introduce our project really quickly. Sorry. So the project that we're working on is called the Empowered Voices Project, which promotes and supports Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse peoples to participate in resource development projects and decision-making processes on the environment at the federal and provincial levels. We have a partnership with BCNWA in BC, as well as Atrewa in Labrador. Not only are we representing Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people, we are promoting the increased use of GBA+, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous-led processes, which can lead to better planning and outcomes in impact assessments for current and future generations. Our goal is to promote long-term, consistent IA participation that is informed directly by Indigenous women and gender diverse people at the community level. We do outreach and speak at different webinars such as this, as well as offer a series of training courses and webinars on GBA+ and impact assessments. The previous version of this project included studies on lived experiences of Indigenous women, mostly in Eastern Canada, and their experiences and impacts from resource development. The reports can be found on our website. And with continued funding from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, it supported the expansion of the work, and I have joined the team earlier this year in BC. Okay, so this is just an overview of what we're going to cover today. So first, we'll just quickly go over the impact assessment process and GBA+, and then connecting the MMIWG calls for justice, and then moving into some research methods and worldviews that can provide better baseline information and shape the process in a better way. We'll talk about some examples throughout and then conclude with what we think the best way forward is. Since we don't have a lot of time, we'll just be going over some of the topics quickly, but you can, ask more questions at the Q&A, and you're always welcome to reach out to us via email to connect further. So to start, an impact assessment, they're conducted to examine the positive and negative effects, which are the impacts that a proposed major project could have. Indigenous communities are the most impacted by resource extraction projects, which include mining, forestry, oil and gas, as well as the associated roads, pipelines, and infrastructures that are necessary for the project. Large projects such as mines, pipelines, and infrastructure projects that exceed a certain threshold have to go through an environmental assessment. So there is a set criteria and a threshold for a project to be considered reviewable, and if it exceeds the thresholds that are in the regulation, then an environmental assessment is automatically required. And if they do not meet the thresholds, then they do not require an environmental assessment, but they'll still require permits and other authorization that will be approved by other regulatory agencies in order to proceed. And I just wanted to share too, because I recently heard about this one project in BC that decreased the room number just by one so that they do not exceed the threshold in order to require an EA. So, stuff like this, because of the threshold, sometimes companies will consider that. So if a project requires an assessment both at the federal and provincial level, then the province can ask to lead the process on behalf of both levels of government using a substitution process. And this is called the One Project, One Review, which has been used regularly in BC. And I just want to show quickly this environmental assessment process that is in BC. So currently this act is actually undergoing review. It has already started and it's projected to go until the end of 2027. The federal process is undergoing review and revision as well. But this is just for reference. I just want to note all the different steps and the different levels of responsibility that is at these different steps. So you have some legislative timelines that the review needs to be completed by within, and then you have different responsibilities such as the Environmental Assessment Office, as well as the proponent times. And then also there are 4 public engagement and comment periods in which people can review the documents and submit and voice their opinions on the topics. And the EAO website has all of these documents and informations for the project that are in process or have already been approved. And I encourage you to take a look if there are any that you are curious about in your area. We do have an extended training on the federal and provincial process, and that takes over the course of several weeks. So I'm sorry I can't spend too long on this section today. And of course, you can feel free to ask me any questions during the Q&A periods.
Yeah, and so I think most are familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just to say that, Indigenous peoples have constitutionally protected rights, which are emerging from case law, if it's the duty to consult, precedent of legal cases that have been brought against the Crown, as well as globally recognized law rights such as UNDRIP, as well as inherent rights or Indigenous laws, which is pre-contact governance systems that have existed before any colonial government imposed this privatized land system. And that has had an incredibly negative impact on our ways of life, obviously, as Canada has formed itself as a nation today. And it also means that each nation really has varied legal rights and claim to title, dependent on what treaty area they're in, if it's unceded. And the land tenure impacts to the ways in which each region has led to kind of these unique governance and territorial management structures that really are dependent on where you are. It's a very place-based type of governance system at this time. And so all of this has implication for the ways in which nations are making relations with external parties like government and industry proponents. And so interestingly, though, there are regulations that are in the new Impact Assessment Act of 2019 that have increased the scope and breadth of consultation and accommodation, including human rights and Indigenous rights instruments that are kind of embedded in the IA process. And one of those is Gender-Based Analysis Plus, and that supports MMIWG calls for justice, which we're going to get into in this presentation. And so what it means, though, is that there's really steps within the regulatory guidelines right now that mandate developers, they have to consider intersectional impacts to diverse subgroups of people, including Indigenous women. And that's never really been the case in all of the previous environmental legislation that has come out in the past. Indigenous issues have tended to be segregated in its own kind of little bubble, which was leading to a lot of court cases, direct action, and a lot of protests, as we've known. And so, there are kind of this new regulatory frameworks then that we really don't understand a lot about how they work or how to use them. And developers, we're kind of all in this boat now where we're trying to figure out what does this exactly mean. And so next slide. And so, what is Gender-Based Analysis Plus? And there's been a lot of good publications. One that we wanted to point out was the IGBA Plus Toolkit Report, which is on the BC EA guidelines. If anybody hasn't seen it, please take a look. And it really talks about an Indigenous lens Gender-Based Analysis Plus framework. And it's a tool that's intended to analyze different intersectional factors and try to understand the sociocultural and historical realities that have resulted from colonization and from systemic racism. And so IGBA Plus is really a framework that Indigenous communities can then apply to their governance, policies, their operations, programs, or projects to try to assess, to measure, and then to mitigate the potential negative impacts, as it relates to Indigenous women, to us folks. And so it's really it's a pathway towards trying to strengthen the traditional roles of Indigenous women in communities, and really recognizing that there are acute negative impacts that are affecting specific subgroups, particularly Indigenous women. And so when we apply the distinction-based lens, there's really a lot of shared experiences across many landscapes and territories where women are sharing the similar issues. They're saying, hey, we're experiencing these impacts from resource development, and they can be linked directly to specific identity factors such as race, socioeconomic status, housing, food security, gender and sexual identity, which can really lead to increased risks or vulnerability factors for certain groups of people. And, Indigenous folks as a society, we're all collectively impacted by resource development projects. And it's Indigenous women, girls, and 2S peoples that really are experiencing they're experiencing a lot of negative drawbacks without actually being able to uptake the positive impacts of resource development as well. And so when we utilize something like Indigenous-based gender analysis plus, IGBA plus, we really try to begin from the position that everyone has specific identity factors that they carry with them, and each carries a level of risk, and these risk levels have to be assessed and addressed to contribute to responsible planning efforts. And so, there's a couple examples that we're going to show you over time, but it's something that's a huge passion of mine to try to spread awareness, because a lot of resource development planning in our regions, and I'm just speaking from lived experiences, that really, Indigenous women have never even been a factor up until about 5 years ago in resource development planning. And even now, the uptake of these practices is very sporadic. Like, there's not really a lot of kind of key or best practices emerging. So it's kind of an emergent field of research, and it really requires a lot of attention to, what's actually happening. And so next slide. And so, we all know that systemic discrimination has been codified into the laws of this country. It has decreased the powers of women and their ability to achieve representation in formal spheres of decision making. And historically, this has taken place, in the form of unequal rights and pay, of disenfranchisement and dehumanization. And it really has enforced patriarchal governance structures through the Indian Act that mirror, Western versions of governance. And so, Indigenous women's space and their traditional roles have been systematically eroded. We are life givers and we are knowledge transfers. We keep our communities together. And so it's really a targeted destruction of our family structures when we are not thinking about, how are we protecting all of our people, all of our families, and all of the people that are in our systems. And so, the National Inquiry really did a lot of leading work in this, and there was a lot of testimonials that directly related to resource extraction projects that really were exacerbating the problem of violence against women and girls. And there were major projects that were driving exposure to transient workers, to incidents of either, violence or assault in the workplace and off-site, and increased substance abuse and addictions, as well as a lack of economic security. And so, there's a lot of, I think tanks that are interested in this. A lot of people are aware of it. So like the Status of Women, a lot of kind of the major, Indigenous governing bodies have made formal submissions that are trying to call for increased attention to the risks of violence that are facing our people. And it's very known and spoken about issue across all our territories. And so, it's really disheartening to see the statistics that show that Indigenous women, 2S peoples, are really overrepresented as victims of violence in Canada. We've heard a lot of different statistics come out, but really, the rate of violence committed by someone other than an intimate partner is 4 times higher for women in remote areas. And testimonials from women across Canada have emerged that really they're saying, hey, there's a link here. Major development and industry operations are having negative consequences for us. And so, when we're researching numbers, because of the rate of violence or hospitalization or police intervention, there's a lot of protected data that's involved in that as well. And it has serious consequences for us to be able to prove or disprove analysis, and reports. And so it's really difficult right away to start to quantify the levels of violent incidents and other crime statistics for First Nations in relations to the developments. And so, it's even more so, we spent a lot of time researching provincial or regional reports as well. And really, not a lot of people are trying to get this data together. And it gets worse the more remote you go. The more remote and northern, the less kind of centralized medical centers are. There's not really a lot of independent research emerging. And it's sort of just kind of there's a forgotten level of, data collection that is occurring that's really kind of getting down to that disaggregated level. And what that tells us is that this issue is really not getting looked at in wider studies or research processes. And where it is researched at the community level, it is not being made public. And it's really problematic for a number of reasons. First is that, our communities are having to prove ourselves over and over and over again that, even though there is scholarly literature that supports this, that this is a globally experienced impact of resource development, that we're really having we're doing a lot of work over and over again to try to prove that, hey, yeah, our people are actually being, negatively affected. And so we really need better research emerging to address this issue head on. And that's kind of why, our organizations are partnering up, and we're really trying to promote that as well. At the federal level, MMIWG considerations are seated within gender-based analysis plus guidelines. And so that means that the quality and outcomes of doing GBA plus is directly linked to how we're responding to the calls for justice right now. And it has very important implications then for how communities can leverage government commitments to address the calls and address violence against women through planning mechanisms such as the Impact Assessment Act. Next slide.
Yeah, and I guess we also want to say too that although GBA plus, the word itself, it sounds like it's centered around gender. That doesn't mean that GBA plus methods and intersectional considerations do not benefit the broader population, because there's no such thing as the average person that the system is designed for. There is rarely somebody who is in perfect physical and mental health, who lives in a major urban center, has consistent, stable housing, financial security, strong social support, and easy access to every service and technology that they need. Real life is not that easy. People have to move between jobs and locations. They need to care for family. They might struggle with illness, or they live far away from services. People may also face access barriers due to location or internet, as well as related to gender, race, income, indigeneity, disability, age, and so on. So when we design systems that incorporate responsible planning, which makes an effort to account for everyone, policies and projects can better suit the needs of different people, as well as make sure that benefits are more evenly spread out. And to just give a quick example, having security measures in a shared work accommodation, especially in these, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, like fly in, fly out work situations, and having security measures such as security cameras, additional lighting in dark corners, building design to make sure that there's enough space between workers or locked doors can help everyone feel safer, not just women. And this can have extended benefits and can help with issues such as theft prevention and property damage, both internally and externally, ease of security and patrolling personnel requirements, and just help people feel safer at night. And it can also be used as evidence if there are staff altercations or accidents. But before we can adopt perfect intersectionality, we must also think about how we can work at levels of equity and justice. And I just want to quickly, reiterate that there is a difference between equality in opportunities and equality in outcomes. And intersectionality is not just thinking about equality, but thinking about equity and justice, especially to support those who need it in society the most in order to reach equality outcomes. So in this picture here, equality, for example, might be providing the same height of ladder for both of the children, even though the tree is a bit farther away for one person. Whereas equity is thinking about providing a taller ladder for the child who needs to reach the tree at a higher, different height. And then, of course, justice is thinking about how can we ensure that there are more equitable access to outcomes in the long-term future. And the same goes for existing research methods and worldview, which are heavily dominated by a colonial patriarchal Western perspective. As we can see, policies that shape resource development and planning are not neutral and have been heavily dominated by a Western perspective that views nature and environment as a tool for humans. When the first colonists came to Turtle Island and they called it Terra Nova, or free land, they saw the land and everything in it as free for the taking. Whereas Indigenous knowledge and worldviews do not see the relationship between humans and the environment in the same way. Oral history, Indigenous science, and knowledge from living on the land provide different teachings and responsibilities to yourself, your community, and the natural world. Research that shape our knowledge and decision making can be done in a more holistic way that takes into consideration of the humans and the natural world. And using methods such as community engaged research, participatory research, and incorporating Indigenous values and worldviews can reconcile some of the differences in how we see our environment and natural resources, and therefore shape our decision making processes around it. So GPA Plus is newly mandated as a part of the IAA 2019. It's still poorly understood and actionized and practiced in resource development planning. What may be a significant impact on specific groups of people may be lost when data is aggregated. The total benefits and impacts are averaged, but when they're separated out or disaggregated, you can kind of see some of the differences and how they might benefit one group and impact other groups more significantly over time. So although this data could be more sensitive to collect when it's done with confidentiality, privacy, and following the principles of OCAP, the real impacts and harms can be more distinctly seen for specific groups of people. And this can allow for community leaders, decision makers, and policymakers to protect those who are more vulnerable and ensure more equitable outcomes. So, for example, we cannot just roll out an employment program and throw people into an unfamiliar industry and say that we have mitigated the issues. A good example of this is looking at the mining industry, where women's presence is already particularly low because of the combination of jobs on development site. And many of the mining center occupations have less than 30% of representation in 72% of the jobs. Women's presence in the mining industry is influenced more broadly by career pathways, which are generally low in the skilled trade, with 3.6% of positions across Canada occupied by women. Since trades account for 13% of mining employment, this number is even lower when accounting for the sub-demographics of Indigenous women and gender diverse peoples. So this means that one size fits all does not apply in preferred hiring when half of the community cannot or will not work on site. And the practice of measuring on the level and the magnitude of impacts on a specific subgroup is often led by developers. Unless communities lead or direct these efforts, any impacts are interpreted through a developer's lens, and they have their own mandates and priorities, which may not respond in ways that reflect community needs or priorities. And this makes community-driven impact characterization and engagements crucial.
I do realize we are over time, so I'm really sorry. I'm going to try to motor mouth the rest of this, but it's very important, so I hope people can hang in there. And so we just wanted to provide a couple examples. And for GPA Plus in practice, I'm very interested in moving reports to action. That's like my whole focus. I really am thinking about it a lot. So when we look at examples, it really kind of gives us a practical kind of, means to think about things. So when we look at household composition for on and off reserve membership is a good example. So frequently, in a socioeconomic study, there might be a percentage of single parent households that are present. And statistically, that's more likely to be comprised of women. And so single mothers are consistently experiencing higher rates of poverty, housing or food insecurity, financial stress compared to dual income households. If we link these demographics and these findings to project impacts, of a proposed project, say a developer wants to build an urban center close to an urban center and house their workers in town. They're going to hire like 1,000 people during the construction phase, and they're all supposed to just kind of, take up rental units in the town. So we can kind of measure the available housing stock in the region against the project needs of the company to understand how rental prices or units are going to become scarcer and more expensive. And that is placing acute hardships on some families while impacting others less. It could be applied to girls or young women that are experiencing more harassment and safety issues because of a worker influx. And this is a wicked issue because, it's often acknowledged as a risk in assessments currently, but developers are really not able to control what their workers do offsite. And so our question is then, can they? Or how are we really getting into that kind of, those difficult problems that are hard to solve? We really need innovative solutions, and we need people thinking about these problems, and it really requires an all hands on deck approach. And the first gender and cultural safety plan in a resource project was in BC, the wood fiber LNG project, which was finalized in 2024. It only recently has MMIWG reporting become mandated as part of that singular project. And it's really, really important because it shows that, other federal impact assessments that are in process right now are not doing that. And that to me shows that there's this push and mandate from community leaderships that's leading to real momentum that can be made in impact mitigation programs. So, as part of the wood fiber plan, there's a lot of different kind of potential harms that were identified to Indigenous women in the community. And the company ended up purchasing an old cruise ship that could be used as housing for rotational workers. And they're trying to locate the port close to the work site, but keep it dry. And so different innovative practices can really emerge as a result of, an intent and focus that is being placed on these issues. And so, there's other LNG projects in northern BC that are planning to implement flotels. However, it's really showing that there's kind of this regional driven approach then that are sort of achieving these positive results. And we should all be kind of taking note of the wood fiber LNG case as an example then of how governance practices can drive change and also act as a vehicle for grassroots voices to be heard. And so the example just on the slide again is just another, we'll skip past it. I'll share this with you all or whatever, but the impact, it's not enough to just say, hey, we're being impacted. There has to be solid interventions and investments by developers as well as other offsetting programs that are put into place. And Christine really did a good job of highlighting that earlier. So we'll kind of segue into the next thing, but I get really excited about impact mitigation. I like talking about it. And so we're really interested in pushing this forward in tangible and actionable ways, and again, it's really not enough to write a report about the risks and just continue with business as usual. That grassroots organizing led to the national inquiry, and it really has contributed to wide movements and the challenges, elevating and giving a voice to the challenges that Indigenous women are facing. And so particularly in remote northern communities, we're going to see a significant increase of activity in the coming years with the critical mineral strategy and the green transition that, we're set to our landscapes are going to change significantly in the coming decades. And we need to have not only adequate data collection programs that consider GBA plus, but really trying to have that community defined and informed programs and services. And it's not the proponents that are going to push this forward, it's us. So, when we talk about relationships with external parties, those are largely represented by our leadership, and it makes, governance practices and priorities then a driver then to really kind of create this change. And there are a lot of different practices that are kind of emerging as novel approaches to impact assessments that are generating positive results. And there's a lot of different interventions and practices that could exist. So honestly, there's really never been a more direct opportunity to advance MMIWG's issues in impact assessments. And so, we're of the opinion that we really need to be capitalizing that immediately and aggressively. That, with all of these new kind of developments, that we are needing to be well equipped to protect our membership in the midst of these changes. And so the QR code here, I just wanted to point this out, is that we were fortunate enough to be able to do some research on impact mitigation for implementing the calls for justice in IA, and there's a lot of good ideas on there. So for folks that are interested, if you want to just scan the QR code, it will take you to a placemat, and then it has other links inside of it as well with additional resources and stuff. So please keep it in your toolbox, if you, whatever you're going to do with it, but I hope that other folks take a look at it. And so, yeah, so essentially, again, it's really something that we've come to know that really grassroots organizing has led us to even get to this space at this time. And that tools like GBA Plus and data collection frameworks are one piece of a larger kind of puzzle that, these issues are serious, they're extremely complicated, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And, even as we're speaking, I always think, what happens to issues that are in ongoing, there's a lot of projects right now that have completed their impact assessments, but they're still contributing to those negative consequences. So, it's something where we need to kind of adapt that GBA plus lens as a practice within our own ways of, doing frameworks and, our organizational structures to really kind of try to tackle these issues from, a multi-pronged approach. So with that, I just wanted to say as well that, we really are trying to offer this tiered training or this kind of a tiered training program. So if you're an impacted person, we would love to chat with you and, teach you a little bit more about the regulatory systems. If you work in lands and resources, we would love to actually offer a GBA plus kind of a practicum model that we're going to be launching as well. So for folks that do want to keep in touch with us, we have our empowered voices at keepersofthecircle.com email available there. So we are always looking for folks that want to join up on our training, and please keep in touch because we're around. Amigos.
Thank you so much, Alex and Sherry. I just want to say, we're so grateful our paths crossed. I highly recommend everyone to go take a look at the website and take a look at all the incredible work they have and continue to do. We can post in the chat as well. Maybe Alex, just the contact information in the website. That way people can direct themselves. And we'll also be sending out a follow-up email after the webinar where we can provide contact information and websites as well. So in saying that, I know we're over time, but I really want to open the floor up to everybody if anyone has any questions or comments for our Keepers of the Circle team here and all the amazing work that they're doing. So, Sophia? Sorry, excuse me if I'm pronouncing it wrong.
No, Sophia is perfect. My apologies, I'm not able to turn on my camera. Something is happening with my computer today. I am joining from Kamloops Aboriginal Friendship Society, from Family Violence Team specifically. First of all, thank you so much for this absolutely amazing opportunity to even get a glimpse on all the meaningful work you're doing. It's fascinating. I especially appreciated the examples. It was a lot easier to understand. I really appreciated the emphasis you made not only on Indigenous women, but also on Indigenous gender non-conforming people. So my question would be, how did your work have to be adapted, or how did your planning of the work had to be adapted to include queer people and the realities in the context of queer existence in mind? How is it different from, tokenistic inclusion of queer people?
Yes, thank you for asking. So what we did to come to the conclusions, and I shared a link with the resources in our file, but we did a qualitative research study that had a national scope, and we did targeted engagement specifically for 2S identifying folks as well to make sure that they had their own platform to answer the same questions, but really kind of, I think the focus group platform was really good because it then allowed them to kind of share experiences between each other, and it led to a really rich discussion. And so we made sure to have our own GBA plus kind of approach as well to make sure that we were collecting that information in a way that we could give a voice to that specific subgroup. And I think it led to a really positive and actually what's funny is that we actually got some of the best feedback about on-site impacts because a lot of them actually worked in the trades, or they were involved in the industry somehow. So we really got a lot of really good feedback in that way. So that was our effort to try to have that perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Does anyone else have any questions for Keepers of the Circle?
I know we're way over time, but
I know.
yeah, but I just want to say again that I really appreciate this, and it's very fascinating listening to some of the comment, even reading the comments from all used about different resources and stuff. So thank you. I've learned things too coming here today.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. I'm going to pass it over to Tina, who's going to do a closing. And I just want to say one more time that we really appreciate and are grateful to have our guest speakers here. And this is what it's all about, right? Just paddling together and ensuring our Indigenous women, girls, and 2S Plus voices are at the center. And it's just amazing to see so many women and grassroots at the center of this work. So I'll pass it along to Tina.
Thank you, Christy. And I'll echo what Christy has expressed is gratitude for our speakers and for all of you joining us today. We just would like to close out with honoring the women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI plus peoples who have shared their truths. Jennifer, sending you love. And we extend our sincerest gratitude to all of you who continue to champion this work, whether it be by reading the plan, continuing conversations, or championing change in your own ways, within your roles, in your homes, and in your hearts. We do this work with and for our women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI plus kin, for our daughters and granddaughters, cousins and sisters, to live free from violence, poverty, and injustice. And we lift up everyone who has helped carry this work. We thank you. And as we wrap up today's session, we would like to take a moment to thank all of you for your presence and joining us today. As we approach the winter season, we encourage you to take this time to rest, reflect, and recharge. The winter solstice reminds us of the beauty in stillness and renewal, and let this season be an opportunity to heal and prepare for the upcoming spring. And we look forward to reconnecting in the future on our shared vision. Thank you all again.